A deadly disease has scorched us, the condemned chained, traditions wiped out, native language substituted. Scared and ill, the little spirit left, I shout combat. Fear still holds us down, my undying spirit shall go on in combat. I look at what has come of us, shame clouds me. However, I fear not, as Fanon said. Shame is a revolutionary sentiment. I smile as I recall his words. It is a work in progress. Fourth Industrial Revolution, changing world order. I still shout, are you blind? The two compartments of the colonial world are still expanding. The dividing line has grown thicker. A world without spaciousness. Men live on top of the other. A hungry town, starved of bread, starved of meat, starved of life, and starved of light. The new world order emerging, the condemned chained, still on our knees. The children of Azania are torn in two parts. Double consciousness outweighs us. A friendly reminder, a call for action in combat. We shout. No matter how well the black subject has mastered the culture and language of whiteness, her body remains black. Aluta continua to Fanon's decolonial spirit of combativity. Aluta continua to the unfinished project of decolonization. Sparks ignited, truth unraveled, mist of darkness now faded. Such a timeless gift bestowed upon us. Aluta continua. The struggle against colonialism still continues. 21st century, digital era, westernization, Western culture is our colonizer, media the deliverer. I write what I like. I am Duduzile Nonkosi Matonzi, 22 years of age. I am a member of the Black House Collective in Soweto. Thank you. Aluta continua.
Welcome to this special event organized by the Rutgers Advanced Institute for Critical Caribbean Studies and the Franz Fanon Foundation. My name is Nelson Maldonado Torres, and I have the pleasure of serving in the double role of Institute Director and Foundation Co-Chair. I am delighted to be on the same table with the founding president and now co-chair of the Franz Fanon Foundation, Mireille Fanon Mendez-Franz, here on my right, in my immediate right, and with executive board member as well as professor of philosophy, Norman Ayari. Thanks so much for being in this activity with us. Another member of the foundation, Asedin Badi, will also join us later in the program via a video recording from Paris, France. I first would like to thank the Soweto-based Black House Collective, which is an organization engaged in Black conscious, Pan-African and decolonial thinking and activity for the gift of the powerful spoken word with which we open this activity. And I also want to thank the International Imagination of Anti-National, Anti-Imperialist Feelings, IIAAF, an umbrella organization on decolonial and abolitionist thought grounded in New York City, but with multiple connections in different parts of the world, for sharing the video that followed the invocation that is part of their ongoing strike on the New York City Modern Museum of Art, or MoMA. There are more than 10 commentaries on the colonial activity, and the first two ones, the video, the audio from the Black House Collective in South Africa, and the one from came from New York City, they are two responses to a call for reflections on decolonial combativity that we're going to be discussing today. I want to, before passing the microphone, as it were, to my dear colleague here, Mireille Fanon Mendes-France, I would like to read a long acknowledgement, which I take from largely from the opening lines of the document called Frameworks and Terms of Struggle of the Strike MoMA campaign. We are meeting on the unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape. We stand in solidarity with Native American and indigenous peoples leading the movements for resurgence, decolonization, and reclamation of their homelands. These lands were stolen to create settler colonial states, and those who were dispossessed continue to live under conditions of siege, surveillance, and extractivist violence. We support land back, an imperative addressed to all settlers and settler institutions, including the Museum of Modern Art and the City of New York, as well as Rutgers University and the City of New Brunswick. At its foundations, this city, like New York, was established on stolen indigenous land and shaped and cultivated by enslaved African peoples. We support the undying fight for Black liberation and its many manifestations here and across the planet. So with that said, I'll pass it to the co-chair of the Frantz Fanon Foundation and founding president, Mireille Fanon Mendes-France.
Thank you, Nelson. Thank you. First of all, welcome to all of us who are following us from all around the world. And allow me to switch a certain time to switch in French, because I am more comfortable to express my thinking. And I'm very happy to share with you this moment. And it is an important one because after 2 years, we can't have any rencontre as we used to have. And it's the first time since these 2 years we are here. And of course, without audience, because it's imposed by the University of Rutgers, and we are always under COVID. But anyway, what it is important in this first part of the decolonial combativity, and it was a point by the Black Collective in Soweto. It's the fight for lands. And it is a part, and Nelson also mentioned, as we are in the territory of a native, it's a part of our decolonial combativity, because the restitution of land is something very important, and it is a question not only here, but also all around the world, and specifically in South Africa, against extractivism, but also in colonized territory by France, in Guadeloupe and Martinique and Réunion and Kanaki and Guyana also. And as you know, I'm sure you are aware about what's happening in these territories. And the people are fighting for their independence and autonomy. And it's now more clear that COVID is just a part of their claim, but the first claim is got independence, and so specifically also the restitution of land. That's why I think to think about what does it mean exactly decolonial combativity is important, because we are always, as a Frantz Fanon Foundation, we are always guided by the thinking of Frantz Fanon, who engage us to think about how to think a new human, and new human could exist only in a decolonial way, and not on as not as a certain person prefer, not only through anti-colonialist to anti-imperialist fight. For the moment, I think it's okay. Thank you.
So we have, in the process of organizing this activity, we drafted a call, an invitation to a number of collectives and organizations that with which we're connected or we have collaborated, that are doing exemplary work in different parts of the world. And we ask them to join us in thinking about the meaning and significance of decolonial combativity. This is occurring, or combative decoloniality. This is occurring in a context where the notion of the decolonial has entered many circles, including in the academy. Here we are at the universities, the university right now, but in many universities, the concept, the idea of the decolonial has entered. And as always it happens in these processes, there are positive sides to that, because there are certain ideas that enter areas that where they were not were present before, but also risks and dangers, because there are forms of cooptation, deactivation of the insurgent dimension of these concepts, of the combative dimension. So we are now shifting to think about combative decoloniality, because if we think of Fanon as a decolonial thinker and agent, clearly was a combative one. And the notion of combativity is one that appears in several of his writings. There are many key important passages about what combativity means on the redshift of the earth, but also toward the African Revolution. And so we thought that it can be a particular Fanonian conceptualization of the notion of the decolonial, that now it is more important than ever, and that could help us to avoid the commodification, domestication of the decolonial thinking and acting today. So it is in that spirit that we convene these colleagues and this conference to think about that. And we have a statement that we would like to read now in a way. It was shared online a few days ago, but we would like to read it between the three of us, and then to hear the responses by our comrades around the world. So, Mirai?
Yes, thank you. I just would like to add, we organize this event because it is the 60th anniversary of the death of Frantz Fanon, and also the 60th anniversary, you have in English and I have in French, of the red shirts of the earth, or of les damnés de la terre. I quote, I read the statement and I quote, finally, a third stage, a combat stage, where the colonized writer, after having tried to lose himself among the people, with the people, will rouse the people instead of letting the people's lethargy prevail. He turns into a galvanizer of the people. Unquote. Watchers of the Rares. I quote, the collective struggle presuppose a collective responsibility from the rank and file and collegial responsibility at the top. Yes, everyone must be involved in the struggle for the sake of the common salvation. There are no clean hands, no innocent bystanders. We are all in the process of dirtying our hands in the grime or our soil, and the terrifying void of our minds. Any bystander is a coward or a traitor, unquote. Readers of the red shirts of the earth are familiar with the often cited sentence, I quote, each generation must discover its mission, fulfill or betray it in relative opacity, unquote. It has been 60 years after the publication of the red shirts and 60 years after Fanon's passing. Yet the sentence reads, as relevant today as it is read then. It might indeed be a timeless sentence, one of those gifts with perennial value from that intense era of decolonization movement towards the middle of the last century. That the traditional empire-based juridico-political colonialism of several centuries was largely, but not totally, vanquished last century does not mean that colonial relations end then. By the time that European empires fell, nation-states had already assumed the duty of preserving institution values and form of social organization that reproduce and or extended the racial logic that characterize the age of modern Western colonialism and that continue to characterize the discourse of modern Western civilization. The conceptualization and treatment of indigenous and racialized population in Europe, including Black, Jew, Gypsies, and Muslim, anticipates the formation of a new model of global power that became the cornerstone of a new nation-state in the former colony. The gospels of discovery and civilization legitimate vast genocide, dispossession, and racial enslavement, all of which solidified racial thinking in Europe and became cornerstones in the birth of new nations. Notable examples include the United States, South Africa, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Argentina, and Australia. But the list is too long to make it justice here. While empire-based colonialism largely ended, nation-based and corporate-based colonialism, as well as local and global coloniality, endure. Whether formally democratic or dictatorial nation-states reproduce coloniality. The struggle against coloniality continues even as the context has changed and the form of domination have often morphed. It is in this situation of relative opacity that Fanon continued to call us to discover our mission 60 years after his death. While many today have turned to celebrate liberal tolerance, corporate efficiency, inclusive excellence, and or resilience in face of climate, in face of climate disaster or evidence of systemic and structural racism. We find that the struggle against coloniality demands first and foremost a combative attitude. We also take this idea from Fanon, who was careful enough to distinguish combativity from mere denunciation and critique. As much as critique and criticism are often praised as a counter-liberal attitude or action par excellence, they are often mobilized to take attention away from coloniality and to openly or surreptitiously support the myth of the cognitive superiority of modern Western civilization. Critique is necessary as insufficient, and it can easily align itself with conservative attitude if it is not deployed in a combative decolonial direction. I pass now the statement to my colleague, Norman.
Different from critique, combativity emerges when racialized subjects start to address other racialized subjects in the effort to generate the sense of a collective struggle. While critique draws its power from crisis, decolonial combativity addresses the catastrophe of modernity coloniality. Combativity goes beyond cries of protests, laments, and appeals, even as these may be necessary moments of the struggle. Combativity is about the path from individual to collective responsibility, and it requires the will and ability to connect with others and to engage in collective movement against coloniality. The combative attitude is, like combative literature, resolve situated in historical time. And it is dedicated to the effort of building the world of you. The trajectory of Fanon's life indicates that combativity calls for transcending the roles of the medical doctor and the scholar. These positions can offer important tools for the process of decolonization, but they can also turn counterproductive if they remain isolated and disconnected from collective movements and struggles. Fanon went so far as resigning from these positions in the effort to connect with a collective of racial and colonial subjects who are struggling for their liberation and independence. Combativity requires similar acts of transgression and resignation from the established standards of recognition and merit. Combativity transcends desires for recognition. It is rather about the possibility of maximizing the possibilities of connection between the condemned of the earth and between their various struggles. Since the struggle against dehumanization continues, how should we then conceive of our combative mission today and how to pursue this mission without betraying it? We invite reflections on the nature of combativity, on contemporary examples of combativity, and on the most important combative task of our day. This includes consideration of how doctors, scholars, writers, and professionals like Fanon can assume the challenge of connecting with people in other positions and help generate a sense of collective struggle. It is important to consider how can medical, artistic, and scholarly training best contribute to struggles for decolonization and decoloniality, as well as how these activities can and should be enriched, redefined, and sometimes even set aside as part of this process. What sort of transformations those who practice medicine, who create art, and or who engage in scholarship need to undergo when working with communities and collectives that come together in the effort to promote change? How can those who work within hegemonic institutions participate in a process of unlearning and relearning with those who work outside these institutions? There is much to learn from those who produce knowledge through organizing and through educating others to organize. How do we support, work with, and learn from those who do not count with institutional resources? How can we effectively counter the extraction of ideas from social movement, community organizers, and social movement leaders? How do we transform medical, artistic, and scholarly training and direct them to oppose extractivism in all its forms? How do we transition to more relational forms of engagement, communication, and collaboration in support of movements that combat systemic racism, coloniality, and anti-Blackness? What can everyone learn from existing combative movements? And what combative movements do we consider particularly critical from our situated position and point of view? These are urgent questions that are very familiar to combative decolonial movements and community organizations across the globe.
Also crucial are questions about the challenges to combativity and combative organizing today in the context of state-sanctioned violence against social movement leaders and protesters, the eradication of free time, as well as the cooptation, mistranslation, and ensuing domestication of movement-based, anti-colonial, decolonial, and abolitionist terminology in state, corporation, and academic projects. This is occurring in the context of the renewal of anti-racist and decolonial movements in multiple parts of the globe, and as a response to demographic shifts in the North that are perceived as threats to the interest and worldview of normative populations. Anything is done to contain the impact of these movements and these demographic shifts. Everything is mobilized to limit the possibilities of dissenting voices and projects to find a fertile ground. The reinvention of apparently benevolent, but not less modern colonial liberalism and neoliberalism through the extension and proliferation of the quote, diversity, equity, and inclusion, close quote, state and corporate industrial complex is one of the most pervasive efforts in this direction today. How to engage in combative struggle when the faces representing the forces of benevolent liberalism are increasingly diversified, and when terms like Black and Blackness are mobilized to support liberal and neoliberal initiatives and projects. In this vein, how to respond to Black and other racialized intellectuals who are sometimes conveniently positioned as brokers in discussions about racism and colonialism by state leaders of the North, while sidelining combative social movements in the North and South. Learning about our respective views regarding combativity and what we consider to be urgent and necessary combative struggles of our time can be of great assistance in bringing more clarity to the task of discovering our mission and doing our best not to betray it. The Franz Fanon Foundation invites you to join us in keeping Fanon's decolonial spirit of combativeness alive by learning from each other, loving each other, and together contributing to the unfinished project of decolonization and decoloniality today. This is the statement that we circulated, and we're still receiving responses from different collectives and individuals in different positions, engaging in different forms of combative struggle. And so the idea is that we wanted to share with everybody these initial responses and begin to create this kind of network of calls and responses globally through the planet, engaging and thinking about decolonial combativity, sharing what our insights about that struggle are, the challenges that we face, and to create kind of a different sphere of knowledge production and distribution and conversations. So without further ado, I think that we can put the videos, and then we will come back after. It will be maybe like some 40 minutes.
Yeah.
And then we will come back and we will comment, add a few ideas, and close. So let's turn to that now.
Tu vas les écouter.
que genera estas violencias. Y la violencia se manifiesta de muchas maneras. Se manifiesta en las maneras en las que nos relacionamos unas con otros. La violencia también viene de arriba, hacia abajo, hacia las de abajo, hacia gente como mucha de la que está aquí, gente negra, gente pobre, gente trabajadora, mujeres y personas de las comunidades LGBT. Sabemos que las cosas están empeorando y empeoran porque hay una crisis que trastoca y nos trastoca nuestros hogares, nuestros familiares, nuestras comunidades, trastoca nuestros centros de trabajo que están enraizados pandemia y que sí está enraizada en las maneras en las que llevamos tantos años sometidas a un coloniaje. Y esto no es hacer de una lucha o de una causa justa política, es saber que nos están asesinando por un asunto de poder, y cuando se habla de poder se tiene que hablar de política. Así es. Así. Porque cuando aquí estamos, cuando salimos a la calle a protestar, cuando nos reunimos para proponer, estamos haciendo política. Y aquí se está construyendo poder, poder popular y colectivo. Y que nosotras y nosotros, la gente que está aquí, la gente que está en sus casas viendo y apoyando, pero sobre todo la gente que está aquí poniendo el cuerpo en la calle, vamos a estar fiscalizando, vamos a estar exigiendo, y nosotras y nosotres no nos conformamos con el tiempo y la línea de tiempo que establecen allá. La urgencia la estamos estableciendo nosotras aquí. La urgencia la estamos dejando ver. Nosotras aquí estamos exigiendo ahora. Ahora. Y nosotras, desde la colectiva, le exhortamos al país que sí, tengamos un espacio para contenernos, que sí, tengamos un espacio para doler, que sí, tengamos un espacio para acompañarnos, que sí, tengamos un espacio para gritar, para rabiar y para soltar todo, sí, y también tengamos espacio para organizarnos, tengamos espacio para movilizarnos, tengamos espacio para protestar. Este país se construye sobre quien lo trabaja, y la gente que está aquí presente y la gente que está apoyando desde sus casas, desde sus centros de trabajo, desde sus comunidades, desde otros lugares, también están construyendo país. Y ese es el país que sí es posible, ese es el país que sí Dios merece, ese es el país que merecemos vivir. Convoquemos, compañeras, compañeros y compañeros, convoquemos, movilicemos y hagamos nuestra esta lucha. Esta lucha es de quien ponga el cuerpo en la calle y organice. Así que de aquí salimos de la emergencia a lo que emerge, de la emergencia a lo que sale de abajo y recorre, de la emergencia a lo que sí es posible. Y si estamos hartas, de verdad, si estamos hartas de las maneras en las que nos tratan, si estamos hartas de las maneras en las que nos acosan, que nos agreden, que nos abusan, si realmente estamos hartas, pues sí, vamos a quemar el cielo si es preciso.
Años de los condenados de la tierra y del fallecimiento de Fanon, el GLEFA se une a las voces que manifiestan un compromiso con su legado en la continuidad en la lucha contra el racismo y la colonialidad. Entendemos que este desafío implica una comprensión de la complejidad del presente y las formas en que hoy se manifiesta la trama de poder y dominación. Luego de varias décadas de movimientos sociales antirracistas, anticlasistas, antipatriarcales, nos damos cuenta de los vicios en los que hemos incurrido y los límites de nuestras acciones y estrategias. Nos enfrentamos al desafío de frenar el lento pero progresivo blanqueamiento de los mundos oscurecidos por la modernidad. La lucha de hoy día hace más urgente que nunca elaborar anticuerpos contra el virus más letal que diezma nuestras comunidades, el deseo de ser como el amo. La resignación abandonar los mundos de vida centrados en la relación con todo lo existente y las propuestas de buen vivir cultivadas por nuestros ancestros y ancestras a cambio de un orden social fundamentado en el mito del sujeto evolucionado, libre, soberano, consumidor, conquistador del mundo, impuesto por el modelo civilizatorio moderno occidental. Cuando hoy la política que atenta contra nuestras comunidades está diligenciada por gente como una, como uno, como une, la lucha se manifiesta en toda su complejidad. ¿Qué hacer cuando agentes policiales y carcelarios, vigilantes de frontera, paramilitares y narcotraficantes, cuando las burocracias estatales, los científicos sociales y naturales y los puestos medios y bajos representantes de los intereses de las empresas extractivistas transnacionales son afrodescendientes e indígenas? Cuando a nombre de las mujeres, de los de abajo, de los negros, de los indígenas, se da continuidad a la política de mercado.
¿Qué hacer cuando la izquierda ya no nos representa más? Cuando el enemigo se viste de pueblo y los que antes combatieron el poder hoy lo detentan valiéndose de las mismas armas a las que alguna vez se enfrentaron. ¿Qué hacer cuando finalmente hemos develado al feminismo para encontrarnos frente a frente con su compromiso ineludible con la modernidad y cuando los movimientos de afrodescendientes se conforman con las migajas otorgadas por el modelo del capitalismo racial o cuando nuestra lucha es por el acceso al mercado y a los bienes producidos a costa de la depredación de todo lo existente? Desde el CLEFAS, desde hace ya casi 2 décadas, hemos estado comprometidas con el desarrollo de procesos formativos de educación popular y formación política dirigidos especialmente a activistas, poblaciones en resistencia, investigadores, investigadoras, docentes y formadoras y formadores de opinión pública. Desde el inicio hemos estado convencidas del potencial de la formación en el fortalecimiento de las luchas comunitarias y de los movimientos sociales que combaten el avance del modelo de muerte. Este trabajo formativo implica procesos de revisión de las propias prácticas políticas, el cuestionamiento de los modelos de mundo que hacen posible nuestras acciones, no solo en los espacios tradicionales de lucha, sino en nuestro quehacer cotidiano, en nuestros modelos de vida, nuestras aspiraciones personales.
Para la política que hacemos ha sido fundamental el reconocernos como bisagra o puente entre los mundos integrados y los mundos en resistencia, los mundos en relación. La reflexión del mundo al que pertenecemos como activistas, al poder que hemos acumulado, los privilegios que hemos adquirido, han sido importantes para reconocer 2 ámbitos de lucha que no son propios o en los que decidimos incidir: el espacio de la producción de saberes legitimados, o sea, el espacio de la academia y de la disputa epistémica, y el espacio de los saberes negados, los espacios de producción de saberes orales y ancestrales, espacios donde se resguardan modos de vida y temporalidades otras de la modernidad. Estamos convencidas de la necesidad de actuar en los 2 niveles.
También hemos comprendido que la descolonización no se da de un día para otro y de ahora para siempre. Creemos necesario entender la lucha enardecida no solo en el juego de la trinchera, sino también en los procesos de huida y resistencia activa que toman forma como modelos de reexistencia comunal, donde la defensa y el resguardo de modelos de justicia y bienestar colectiva más allá y más acá del capital, de la razón imperial, del ideal de progreso y la producción de jerarquías condenatorias de unas vidas sobre otras. En esta trama, la lucha se nos presenta a modo de cimarronaje, que escapando a los confines de la plantación, produce mundos de vida y restaura la relación perdida, desafiando el orden impuesto y globalizado por el sistema mundo moderno capitalista.
Lo fundamental para nosotras es un proyecto de liberación construido por los condenados del mundo, desde diferentes lugares y desde diferentes experiencias, unos condenados del mundo cuya política esté comprometida con la confrontación a todos los sistemas de dominación y con la posibilidad de existencia de una multiplicidad de mundos, algo para lo cual el legado de Fanon es indispensable y su vigencia incuestionable. En efecto, la fuerza de su palabra y la potencia de su existencia son hoy cimientos fuertes sobre los que seguimos accionando. Por ello, nos sumamos como glefas desde nuestras propias experiencias a esta conmemoración, pues, como dice el mismo Fanon, en los condenados de la tierra, el final de una emboscada no significa el descanso, sino el momento de que la conciencia avance un poco, porque todo debe ir a la par.
On behalf of my Roman brothers and sisters, thank you. It's really an honor from a Romanist perspective to be able to share a few thoughts on the work of Fanon and the legacy he left to us. To not fall into the trap of whiteness, the ideology of integration, which is built to control and domesticate us. Instead, here we are thinking and building strategies, struggles from our embedded experiences against whiteness, putting into evidence the traumatic experiences that our people face by structural racism, while many are still trying to hide those experiences under the mask of democracy, human rights, and rule of law. Fanon is a thinker, as a militant, embedded and expressed the experiences, frustrations, and hopes of all the racialized people that are trapped. We are trapped in a dehumanizing white world. There are many eye-opening lessons and debates that the work of Fanon has brought to the struggle of Roma, to our collective Kaleamenge, to help us build a path to Roma collective emancipation, and more importantly, to learn from the shared experiences with our racialized brothers and sisters, experiences that we intimately relate to and feel as ours. The white world has placed us out of the political debate as condemned savages incapable to govern ourselves. So our struggles and our rights as collectives are violated every day, and our collective political agenda is pushed to the margins of the political debate. However, with the work of Fanon, we understand that within the marginality we are not alone. We share this space and struggle with other people, with other racialized people, with our Muslim brothers and sisters, with people of African descent, with all racialized brothers and sisters. No? Our common project is to end the domination of the white man and to remove him from the pedestal where Western modernity has placed him. Our objective is not to remove him and replace him with another one, then we would be reproducing the same racial logics. Rather, it's about destroying the pedestal in order to build a new world. Fanon forces us to look into the gut of modernity and helps us reconvert and reconnect our knowledges and practices into political forms of resistance, those practices and knowledges produced and practiced by our ancestors. Through his work, we find political tools to help ourselves and reconstruct us from the ashes, from what they have done to us, from what the white world has done to us. It is also our duty as anti-racist militants to not allow Fanon's work to be depoliticized and reappropriated. by the white critical movement and liberal integrationists. As Fanon shows us, being critical is not enough, especially nowadays, when certain amount of criticism is not only tolerated, but fashionable and welcomed by the white system. To confront structural racism is to confront the racial state. From Kalea Mengele, we always say, an anti-racist movement that does not question white power, that does not openly confront the state and its tentacles, an anti-racism that serves as a cane for whiteness to lean on, and that is only concerned with building alliances with white movements and dialoguing with the state, it is not and will never ever be a weapon of emancipation for the racialized people. So the only way to pay tribute to Fanon legacies is to keep our fight alive and to build the decolonial combative struggle. Long live the fight.
They speak about abolition, they speak about decolonization, they speak about anti-imperialism, they speak about love. But all they do is either harm or step aside or betray. So when we made that banner, we said betray empire. But what do we get? A job with a description. So what are we going to do about it?
We got a letter. Glenn Lowry received a letter telling him we were coming today. And he's such a fucking coward. He's such a fucking coward that he's gonna let his security and facilities people have to bear this confrontation. They're forced to do this job.
They have no choice. They know the change. They see the change.
We don't have no beef with them. This is what they do. They send black and brown bodies out to the front. Poor working class black and brown bodies out to the front while he's sitting up in a penthouse watching on his security camera. And so now he's afraid that if he doesn't push us back, Glenn is watching him in that fucking camera and he's gonna have a problem.
Mr. President, it really was a beautiful operation.
I want to thank Marie-José Gravis for your incredible leadership.
Represents colonialization, white supremacy, the reason why our ancestors died. We say no more.
Greetings and immense gratitude to Mireille and Nelson for having invited me, as many others, to participate in this, the 60th anniversary of Frantz Fanon's passing and the publication of The Wretched of the Earth. This is an important reminder that our current struggles are not new ones, but a continuation of old struggles. I appreciate in particular the invitation to reflect on the meaning of combativity today, combative decoloniality. And my own personal struggle is embodying decolonial practice that serves and honors the body, spirit, and mind at both individual and collective levels. And by collective, I'm talking about Black people and dispossessed indigenous populations in general, and within those populations, people with disabilities, not forgetting those with mental health difficulties, members of the LGBTQIA plus communities, but Black women in particular. But being a Black woman for me is not only about who I identify as, but also a double-edged sword, at once immensely oppressed, but also capable of being the most effective tool for destruction once co-opted. We see this in politics and the academy in recent times, in fact. And a good example is Condoleezza Rice, who in her role as National Security Advisor and Secretary of the State was a strong proponent of the 2003 illegal invasion of Iraq. Recently, as a political science professor, we saw the same Condoleezza Rice seeking to dismantle critical race theory. This observation is important for me as a Black woman within the academy, especially a westernized university born out of colonial pillage, and which in many ways continues to thrive on and also continues to sustain coloniality. This observation informs and reminds me about the need to always strive to embody decolonial practice in order to serve and honor the body, mind, and spirit. We're asked to share some of the concepts, terms that help us in this struggle. And one of the terms that I draw on is occupational consciousness, which is a term that I coined, which is defined as an ongoing awareness of the dynamics of hegemony, an appreciation of the role of personal and collective occupations of daily life in perpetuating hegemonic practices, and an appraisal of resultant consequences for individual and collective well-being. The occupation part of the term is drawn from my own profession, occupational therapy, but also the discipline occupational science, recognizing that our personal resources of time, energy, and capacities are constantly occupied, which begs the question, to what end are we occupied? Who benefits and who loses both from and through our everyday doing? And consciousness is a term you're familiar with, but informed by liberation philosophy. Fanon, again, playing an important role, but also Steve Bantu Biko and Enric Dussel. And all three understanding consciousness as both a mental attitude and a commitment to fight all forms of subjugation. These terms, both occupational consciousness and consciousness, may be experienced as burdensome, but not when approached and understood as part of a collective emancipatory project. And there are other strategies which are witnessing, remembering, and conscientizing that go with that. But what I've also learned to appreciate with time is that one cannot conscientize those one does not love deeply. And it is through understanding our shared struggles that we cultivate that love, not forgetting prayer to the body, mind, and spirit. Thank you.
Saludos, les habla Jesús Chucho García desde la República Bolivariana de Venezuela. Soy activista de los movimientos afro-venezolanos aquí en Venezuela, así como también cofundador de la articulación regional afrodescendiente de las Américas y el Caribe, ARAC. Para nosotros, hoy, dar una lectura de los planteamientos de Fanon y traerlo al siglo XXI constituye un elemento esencial de lucha, de batalla de los movimientos afrodescendientes, en este caso muy concreto afrodescendientes, contra 4 elementos que nos están afectando a nivel planetario. Primero, la redimensión del racismo, y en su fase de exterminio racial, casi peor que en la época de la esclavitud. No, peor cuando los linchamientos en Estados Unidos. Esta vez son millones de personas, miles de afrodescendientes que están siendo masacrados en Colombia, en Estados Unidos, en Brasil, en Haití. Y eso demuestra cómo el exterminio racial, ese racismo que tanto criticó Fanon, hoy representa una atrocidad, una deshumanización. El segundo elemento tiene que ver con las migraciones, la xenofobia, es decir, aquellos países que fueron colonizados y explotados hasta la saciedad por las grandes potencias, hoy parte de esa gran población está migrando, buscando una nueva forma de vida, pero lo rechazan, no, ya no sirven, son desechos humanos. El tercer elemento es el proyecto minero extractivo, que se inició en 1492 y que hoy representa un peligro porque está provocando el calentamiento global. El cambio climático se ha acelerado. Las reservas de agua dulce nos quedan apenas en un 4% a partir del año 2030, ¿no? Por otro lado, eso ha representado, ¿verdad?, sequía, explotación de africanos, de afrodescendientes a nivel planetario. Lo tercero es la ciberguerra. La ciberguerra tiene que ver con esa nueva modalidad que se implementan a partir de las 800 bases militares que tiene Estados Unidos alrededor del mundo. El colonialismo está vivito y coleando. Y Fanon lo dejó muy claro, y hoy reivindicarlo con los movimientos sociales es una obligación fundamental para salvar el planeta. Gracias.
Hello, my name is Lee Seok Ko. I am a professor of Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm teaching the art and literature from the third world. Before I begin my talk about the meaning of collectivity and combativity of Frantz Fanon in my context, let me express my gratitude to Fanon Foundation for giving me this honorable opportunity to commemorate the 60th year of publication of Fanon's book called The Wretched of the Earth. Considering the contemporary Korean society, I think that we need to add one more struggle to the classical or conventional struggles proposed by Fanon. Two classical struggles of Fanon are firstly the collective struggle against coloniality, and secondly, the struggle against colonized psychology. Based on this, let me add one more struggle, as I mentioned earlier, which is the struggle against the conservatively changing psychology of the Korean wretched themselves, who believe that they are no longer belonging to the class of the wretched. Korean ruling class is very successful in terms of inculcating the mistaken hope of better life to the Korean wretched by materializing their promises on the realization of the welfare state, democratic society, expansion of economic safety zone, and so on and so forth. In reality, some of the promises are actually achieved. My problem with the Korean society is the fact that because of this mirage internalized in the mind of the Korean wretched by the repetitive brainwashing from the ruling class, the orientation of a collective struggle is losing the direction. It is becoming very, very difficult in Korea to identify the one against whom should we fight and for what should we mobilize our collective will. Just recently, I wrote a play called Fanon Lesson and directed it myself to put it on one of the Korean theaters. The play consists of 4 acts. One is titled Flying Dutch Woman, 2, Egyptian Book of the Dead, 3, A Note of Return to My Native Land, 4, Ancient Oedipus. The message that I wanted to deliver to my Korean spectator is the fact that Korean wretched is becoming conservative, not because of the actual change of a reality, but because of the metaphoric or metonymic expectations of possible change which will be given by the domineering group as a gift. We are forgetting the past event which happened just 5 years ago. About 1 million people every day for about 3 months gathered together in Gwanghwamun Square to demand our collective will, which is to dethrone the corruptive regime of the time and made it success without letting even one drop of the blood of the people. We Koreans have such great memory of candlelight revolution, but the current regime betrayed that wonderful revolution by means of the more sophisticated ruling strategy, so that Korean wretched is truly believing that we are moving forward. This is why my play called Fanon Lesson wanted to touch the pseudo-gospel of the current regime physically and to say that we are being cheated. We need to be awakened. We need to break the root of our collective unconscious, which is becoming conservative. I, as an academic, as well as an artist, attempt to adopt Fanon's legacy to bring about the optimistic change to Korean and international community. Korean society seems to slip away from the normative application of Fanon's tactics against coloniality and morbid psychology of the have and the have-nots. But if we carefully look at the status quo of the Korean wretched and add one more serious fight against their conservatively changing collective unconscious, we still have a hope that Korean society is able to provide a global model of better community, which is the dream of Franz Fanon. Thank you very much.
Hola, un abrazo a todas las personas que nos escuchan a través de esta publicación en esta conmemoración de los 60 años ya de la publicación de Los Condenados de la Tierra, así como también de la partida física de Franz Fanon. En la comunidad de Piñones, en Loíza, Puerto Rico, combatimos y mantenemos ese espíritu combativo, y no solamente el espíritu, sino las acciones combativas para luchar en contra de todas las opresiones, en contra de ese racismo estructural, institucional, cotidiano, es decir, ese racismo sistémico que nos afecta continuamente. Estamos combatiendo todos los días a través de, por ejemplo, esos tambores y la música que practicamos aquí de bomba, las imágenes del gigante, el reconocimiento a través de la educación de nuestro centro cultural de lo que es las figuras importantes que han contribuido, esas figuras de afrodescendientes, de mujeres y hombres negros y negras que como Silvia del Villar, Rafael Cortijo, Rafael Hernández, Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, todas estas figuras que son importantes en nuestra historia y en nuestra vida. También recordar la batalla de 1797, cómo Piñones recuerda, Piñones sí se acuerda de ese evento y la participación de los milicianos negros en la liberación de Puerto Rico. Puente cultural de África Piñones, así que hacemos un trabajo de educación, que nuestros niños y niñas estén conscientes de las aportaciones que hacen sus hombres y mujeres negros, no solamente de la comunidad, sino a esos pensadores intelectuales como lo fue Fanon en nuestra iconografía, en nuestra vida, en nuestra historiografía, pues del Caribe y del mundo. Así que desde COPI un abrazo, un saludo a la Fundación Fanon. Estamos aquí siempre combatiendo. La música de bomba es parte de esos elementos que utilizamos para mantener activa, viva la comunidad también. La defensa de nuestra tierra, bien importante, la defensa del territorio y la protección de los recursos naturales, que al fin y al cabo son los que nos dan vida, los que nos protegen, los que nos dan oxígeno y los que nos mantienen en vida y en salud. Así que gracias y muchas cosas lindas para la Fundación Fanon.
Tejiendo pensamientos y acciones para el combate a la deshumanización colonial desde diversas trincheras existenciales. Si me preguntas qué es la libertad, te diré que es no tener miedo. Así lo expresaba desde la trinchera del combate a la deshumanización la cantante y militante Nina Simone. Esto hilamos con el pensamiento de Fanon, que planteaba todos esos hombres que tienen hambre, todos esos hombres que tienen frío, todos esos hombres que tienen miedo. Otro hilo que sumamos a este tejido del combate decolonial es desde el pensamiento político de Juan García, al plantear que la lucha pasa por la identificación y confrontación al antagónico. El antagónico es el que siempre te ha jodido la vida, y es el hombre blanco. Y otro hilo para seguir tejiendo en concordancia con este pensamiento es el que plantea el exjugador de fútbol y activista Lilian Thuram. El pensamiento blanco no es el pensamiento de todas las personas blancas, es un pensamiento del mundo. Es decir, cuando hay dominación, recibes una educación a través de la mirada de quien domina y terminas por asimilar su discurso. Es por eso que te digo que el pensamiento blanco es poderoso. Educa a las personas blancas a pensarse inferiores, menos aptas. Desde mi experiencia, mi existencia y mi trinchera de pensador, artista y militante afrodescendiente, intelectual nativo, como lo plantea Fanon, ha sido trabajado desde la contemporaneización del cimarronaje y la fuerza e inspiración de nuestros ancestros y ancestras en esas luchas por la libertad, convirtiendo esa experiencia histórica en teoría política de rehumanización frente a la teoría de deshumanización, como plantea también Fanon. Volver a ser lo que éramos antes y no lo que nos han dicho que somos, enseñaba Juan García. El ir tejiendo en nuestras luchas en los diversos campos, filosofías existenciales, estrategias de reexistencia y resistencias, vienen siendo nuestros hilos existenciales con que aportamos a esa trama del combate decolonial, reforzando procesos de desaprender ese pensamiento blanco del mundo que nos domina y reaprender lo propio como procesos de rehumanización y liberación. Estos son ahora nuestros caminares y andares, nuestros derroteros existenciales, peleando y exigiendo nuestros derechos, peleando por una educación propia y decolonial, en lo académico, posicionando nuevos epistemes y repensando de manera crítica las universidades de los pueblos, como es el caso de la Universidad Amauta Iguasi. El fin lógico de esta voluntad de lucha es la liberación absoluta del territorio nacional. Frantz Fanon.
When they try to cut your pay either through direct cuts or never giving you a pay rise, how many years have most people at university had their pay frozen? When they try to rip up your conditions, when they try to redirect your hours so you don't get to see your family or live in your community, when they overwork you, and when they take away the guts of your pension scheme, which is the best asset most working people have if they've got a defined benefit scheme, you know you're in the middle of class struggle.
My name is Oscar Guardiola, and I'm coming to you today, 3rd of December 2021, from Tavistock Square in London, where members of the UCU, the University and College Union, are gathering for a rally to mark the 3rd day of a strike action. 58 colleges and universities across the whole of the United Kingdom have gone on strike. This is what combat, real combat, actual combat looks like. Frantz Fanon was very fond of so-called explosive or extended metaphors, metaphor filet. For instance, void, vortex, explosion, shock. The point of combat actions is to send the shock to the system. But the managers and employers against whom we're fighting together in solidarity today would like you to believe that that kind of shock is misplaced, that it is violent, that it rushes ahead, unthinking, and unreasonable. In fact, strike actions such as this one, or the MoMA strike earlier this year, as well as the general strike in my home country in Colombia, are moments for thinking. It's like pressing the pause in the machine that would like you to speed up and work ever more efficiently. To pause is to give time to time, to interrupt the order that comes from above, the order to kill, the order to make sure that the machine keeps working. To give pause is also to produce spaces for breathing, giving time to time, giving ourselves time to think. And that is the kind of combat that we're exemplifying today here. When one occupies spaces such as these during a strike action, one develops a different relationship with others as well as with the city surrounding us. It is like a rehearsal for revolution.
What a fascinating series of videos and interventions. Now, myself and my comrades and friends are going to discuss those videos, discuss this notion of combativity, discuss the inspiration, this series of interventions, this text by Nelson and Mireille sparked. And I'm going to start having a little discussion, and then I'm going to let my friends and comrades share their ideas, feelings, and analysis with you. Of course, I find this notion, this Fanonian notion of combativity, absolutely crucial and fascinating. And first of all, because if we are talking in terms of combativity, and if Fanon used this notion, it always implied, it always necessitated another notion, which is the notion of enmity, the notion of enemy. There is no combat without an adversary. There is no combativity without enmity. And of course, this whole series of interventions showed that there are many different enemies, but in terms of our Fanonian heritage and thinking, one of those core enemies is necessarily white supremacy. And the notion of combativity and enmity is crucial because it reminds us that a white supremacist world, a white supremacist society cannot coexist with other forms of societies. It is not possible to imagine this liberal, multicultural idea that it is possible to have other forms of society, other modes of existence that will coexist with a white supremacist center, with an imperial core of domination still in place. Those two things, a multiplicity of existences, of imaginative forms of forming communities and inhabiting them, is incompatible with the remaining order that is still in place. And many of those interventions involved the notion of dehumanization. And this dehumanization is, of course, at the core of Fanon's thinking about race, racism, anti-Blackness, anti-Muslim regimes in our modernity. And it is also something that inspired many of those contributions and interventions. So the problem is not, at first, a political or even economic regime. As Eric Robinson put it, the problem lies in the core tenets of the European civilization. And so that's why I think a notion that is that fascinates some people and that some other people hate is important. And this notion is, I think, the notion of pessimism. I think we need a good use of this notion of pessimism and what it means. Pessimism is not despair about Black, indigenous, and colonized people. It is the end of hope about the possibility of reforming the present order by liberal means. And I really think we need, and that's what I think we can draw from Fanon, we really need to despair from Europe. We really need to despair from the possibility of integration or assimilation within its framework, to reach out, to reach the possibility of imagining new forms of collective organization. I think there is an intrinsic pedagogy within this notion of pessimism. It is the starting point of Black nationalism, right? The idea that it is not possible to integrate within the United States. It is the starting point of Pan-Africanism, the idea that the only way to fight white supremacy is an incredible empowerment of the African continent and through its unity. It is at the core of the very idea of Black anti-colonial and decolonial independence and autonomy. This call for autonomy is actually, I think, draws from the idea that there is nothing to hope from the present world order as it exists. And I think more profoundly, it means that the wretched of the earth, les damnés de la terre, the damned of the earth, do not have their destiny or their future beyond themselves. They first have to relearn to desire themselves and their own existence and their own autonomy. I think this is absolutely fundamental because we are facing several problems here. We're facing the history of anti-Blackness and other forms of racism, I think, has three main instantiations, so to speak. Comrade Jesus from Venezuela, we're talking about Black and other colonized people facing extermination, mass extermination, and genocide today. So this notion of Black genocide, which was present in the 1950s, for instance, in the US with the We Charge Genocide petition that Mireille had been working on recently. It was also present in 1975 in the French Assembly when Aimé Césaire was talking about the genocide by substitution that the French government was putting in place in the French Caribbean. This notion that Black people are deprived of the very conditions of their existence, I think it is at the core of our combative mindset and concepts. You also have all those things that the Strike MoMA movement underlined, that is to say, the notion of expropriation and extractivism. Black and colonized people, non-white people are facing those processes of expropriation in terms of lands, in terms of goods, in terms of bodies, right? We cannot forget that slavery and chattel slavery, but other forms of slavery and forced labor as well, were forms of extracting racialized bodies and dehumanizing them for the profit of the few. And also this form of cultural expropriation, which is an active destruction of our past and traditions. And then we have the third notion, after the notion of genocide and notions of expropriation and extraction, you have the third notion, which is a notion of alienation, which is also fundamental in Fanon's early works, of course, since the provisional title for Black Skin, White Mask, Pour Noir, Masque Blanc, was an essay on the disalienation of the Black. And this notion of alienation is way more crucial than some people may think, because the critique of alienation and the fight against alienation is not about cultural nostalgia, melancholy, those kind of things about a long gone past. Rather, it's really about opposing an introjected self-destructive impulse in racialized people, the idea that they're not good enough, the idea that the only way to redeem themselves is to negate what they are, and it can even turn into forms of internalized violence and self-destructive actions and interventions. So all those things, genocide, expropriation, alienation, are three forms of racism and dehumanization that I think define global white supremacy today. And we can learn from all those forms of activism, those forms of intervention, radical intervention in the public space, in the cultural sphere, in the university, in the media. We can learn from them, we can invest them, and we can never forget that there is no combativity without knowing, designating, and actively participating in the destruction of our enemy.
Greetings to everyone. I am joining my voice to the ones of my fellow Frantz Fanon Foundation board members to thank you all for participating to this commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the passing of Frantz Fanon, maybe one of the most prominent critical fighters. I am saying fighter because the Frantz Fanon Foundation decided to center that notion of combativity in the definition of what decoloniality is about, in order to stress the need for critical thinking and knowledge to put themselves at the service of the struggles of the people of the South, and not the other way around. It means bridging the gap between thinkers and the reality of struggles, not to feed the academia with some first-hand testimonies, but to break the hegemony of the white knowledge production system. The decolonial movement cannot be satisfied with being an academic cenacle producing critical thought. The decolonial movement is part of the struggles of the peoples of the South, whose condition it tries to think about within the framework of white supremacy and to participate in thinking, and I do mean participating in thinking, in elaborating strategies of liberation. What can the critic do alone in the face of state repression? What can critics do? Write and have people sign their tribunes in newspapers? It can be useful indeed, but it's not sufficient. Criticism alone, as we stress it in our call, criticism alone can provide also colonial powers with the means to reform their narrative and to blur further the lines a bit more. There's an attempt to mummify Fanon and to separate him from the real struggles of the peoples of the South by locking him up in the past. This is the case of many critical thinkers of yesterday's struggle, that the colonial world tries to lock up in its museums in order to better set itself up as the only horizon of the future. As we stress it in our call, combativity means taking responsibility in the collective struggle. This is why, as this video is also about presenting examples of combative ways to advance the decolonization agenda, I will briefly, and very briefly, because my video has to be short, I will briefly speak about the case of France, that poor, small, provincial state of France. As you may know, the French political class is descending into a racist frenzy, and there are ongoing forms of combative decolonial answers that are building to challenge it. You may not have heard of them because the situation, in fact, is pretty serious. In that video, I cannot cover the whole situation of the decolonial movement in France and decolonial organization, but you may connect with Mireille, with Norman, and with Nelson, and with many fellow Frantz Fanon and our comrades, brothers and sisters, to have more information. I will just stick to what I've prepared. So you may or may not have heard that decoloniality is deemed a threat in France, just as critical race theory is in North America. In fact, we are speaking about the same global phenomenon, the radicalization of white supremacy. Here I want to stress the importance of that fact, and I would have been glad to discuss it with all of you today, but I cannot be there, so that's my input about that. That frenzy, anti-decolonial frenzy, is the expression of a global phenomenon that we knew in the caricatural form of Trump in the US or with other leaders in European countries, but it's a global phenomenon. But I will just stick to the French case. In France, alongside with decoloniality, it is the very claim of the autonomous existence of Blacks, Muslims, and indigenous communities that is deemed a threat to the old white nation state. It's the case in France, but it's also the case in all Euro-American countries that are facing their identitary crisis, as I would call it. One should remember here, and it's very important to me because as an Algerian, I remember that Fanon himself left his institutional position as a psychiatrist to join and support a liberation movement, the Algerian liberation movement, that was called in this time terrorist and separatist, and that was treated with the full brutality of the colonial security apparatus, in that case the French colonial security apparatus. Today, it is in the form of the struggle against separatism that the French security apparatus is scrutinizing Muslims and every movement or organization linked to them. With the adoption of the so-called anti-separatism law, the French state got the possibility to further discipline the lives of Muslims in France by controlling all forms of Muslim political expression in the name of the struggle against terrorism. By extension, all expressions of what is called communautarism or communitarianism are considered as forms of separatism that have to be fought by all the legal, pseudo-legal means. The decolonial movement here is considered as the door opener of these evil forces threatening the old white France, its old white identity. Through these means, the old white nation state tries to prevent racial counterpowers such as black power, Muslim power, and all racial subaltern subjectivities from challenging the power of the white population on the definition of the state and society. Just as the Frantz Fanon Foundation is proud to have been supporting the development of black power within the decolonial movement through the Afro-decolonial platform La Question Noire, we have been supporting, since its inception, the coordination against the separatism bill that has been gathering combative actors of the French Muslim community and decolonial organizations to build the means of an autonomous Muslim power linked to the global Muslim community to allow the struggle against Islamophobia to go beyond denunciation and dismantle the legal, social, and political framework preventing Muslims from living, creating, thinking, and building as Muslims in France. Combativity means to know how and when to take sides and to be patient and constant. We are facing the inevitable process of the shifting of the balance of power from old colonial powers to a new configuration, where the struggles will be numerous and where we will have to be, as decolonial thinkers and activists, critical fighters. I salute all of you and pray for our collective success. God bless you.
Je vais m'exprimer en français. Ma pensée sera beaucoup plus claire. I'm sorry for all those listening and don't speak French, but later it will be translated subtitle. J'ai trouvé très intéressant l'ensemble de ces présentations et qui montrent une continuité, enfin une cohérence des combats qui s'articulent autour de choses à peu près identiques. Norman a précisé que c'était effectivement contre la suprématie blanche, mais plus spécifiquement, en ce qui concerne en tout cas les personnes qui ont participé du côté de l'Amérique latine et des États-Unis aussi, c'est quelque chose qui est plus centré sur ce racisme structurel qui effectivement tue et que d'ailleurs Frantz Fanon, aussi bien dans Peau noire que dans Les damnés de la Terre, avait mentionné et avait analysé de manière assez intéressante au point que jusqu'à maintenant on peut se servir de son analyse et son analyse a quelque chose aussi de particulier, c'est qu'elle ne nous limite pas à cette analyse, elle ne nous demande pas de répéter son analyse comme ça ad libitum, mais à partir de cette analyse, on peut aller beaucoup plus loin et on peut entrevoir ce que pourrait être le monde du vous dont il nous parle. Ce monde du vous qui est un monde décolonial, qui est un monde où les référents ne sont plus ceux qui nous ont été imposés depuis les découvertes, ce que Nelson appelle les découvertes catastrophiques, découvertes catastrophiques à partir de 1492. Et c'est quelque chose qui nous pousse peut-être vers l'optimisme, peut-être, alors que nous sommes dans un monde particulièrement pessimiste et où justement il y a assez peu d'espoir, où on est en tout cas borné par un certain nombre d'ennemis, mais d'ennemis qui sont aussi des ennemis mortifère. Donc je trouve que ces 10 vidéos portent en elles aussi une forme d'optimisme, une forme de possible et une forme d'ouverture au monde. Et en ce sens, elles sont extrêmement congruentes et cohérentes avec le travail de Fanon, qui ne cesse en fait de nous engager à ne pas s'arrêter à la réalité des choses, mais d'aller au-delà de ces réalités, afin de prendre des chemins de traverse, quelque chose qui nous oblige aussi à penser un petit peu différemment du dogme et de ce qui nous est imposé. Et donc, ça nous sort un peu de ce conservatisme qui a été mis en avant par la personne de la Corée du Sud, Lee Seok-ho. Et son analyse sur ce conservatisme et sur la façon dont il impacte la psychologie au sein de l'université est aussi quelque chose d'extrêmement porteur, puisque on ne peut pas oublier que Fanon est sorti de ce conservatisme, en tout cas en adoptant une façon qui lui était particulière et qui venait de cette psychanalyse institutionnelle, enfin anti-institutionnelle, en passant par Saint-Alban avec Toscaïès, lui a fait faire un pas de côté et lui a fait aborder la maladie mentale et donc l'émergence d'un vous qui soit restauré dans son inconscient et dans son conscient, lui a permis de voir comment est-ce que dans un cas d'aliénation, dans un cas de colonisation, dans un cas d'hégémonie, on peut aussi sortir guéri, mais plus que guéri, on peut sortir ce qu'il appelle l'homme nouveau, on peut sortir construit totalement différemment à partir de ce travail qui touche à la fois la sphère mentale, mais avec une volonté de libérer, d'émanciper l'homme et de ne pas l'obliger à être confronté à des conservatismes ou à des logiques mortifères telles qu'on les voit à l'heure actuelle. Et en ce sens, ces 10 vidéos, interventions, ces 10 déclarations sont extrêmement encourageantes et elles nous engagent à continuer et à ne pas nous laisser enfermer dans quelque chose qui nous est imposé et à aller plus loin et à penser que l'alternative, c'est à nous de la construire et c'est à nous de l'imposer. Donc la question que je poserais comme ça à vous deux, c'est quelle serait la suite à partir du moment où on admet qu'il y a une combativité décoloniale et où on s'inscrit donc dans une décolonialité qui questionne différemment le pouvoir, la connaissance et l'être, alors quelle serait la prochaine étape de cette décolonialité combative? Quelle serait la mise en marche, la mise en action de cette décolonialité combative? Do you understand what I mean?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. I mean, it's. I want to highlight three main points in conversation also with the videos, and I think in conversation with your presentations too. And I found that particularly important and appealing the discussions on extractivism and on occupation. Right, those stood out as two very important concepts. And I think that we have a challenge, particularly in places like the academy, to think about the many ways in which the modern Western research university system has been deeply embedded with practices of extractivism. Right? Collections of archives. Think about museums, pillage of works of art. Think about scientific expeditions going to different parts of the world. Think about and what they involved and what they presupposed.
think about even the archives of books and publications. Think about, what does it mean when a text like The Pressure of the Earth goes from the hands of combatants, right? From people organizing in the struggle to university halls, to schools, where the book is now read for getting credit in certain areas, for publication in certain areas, which implies a certain activity about connecting and developing theoretical concepts, sometimes without an actual involvement or relationship with the social movements, which arguably are the very blood that runs through the text, right? And the very blood and the neurons too, that, the cerebral mass is in movement and is there. So I think extractivism takes different forms, multiple forms. It has to do, of course, with mining, resources, taking land, pillage, but also it has to do with this form of taking ideas and concepts from living texts and living documents and arts and somehow dissecting them and transferring, making them into something else, which could have its use, but also disconnected from those struggles, it oftentimes can easily become a tool against those very movements. And I think there is a lot of that, So I think extractivism is a very important area that requires a lot of thinking and that appears and is highlighted in some of the videos. The same with the notion of occupation. Right? Occupation, like our time is occupied, our body is occupied, right? Everything around us occupies our mind, our projects. So what do we do then, right? And how we do then with movements like Decolonize This Place and other movements, for example, in New York City, including the IIAAF, and part of the strike MoMA is about the deoccupation. It's not about occupation, it's about deoccupation, the deoccupation of certain spaces that have been occupied by the forces of coloniality, by the coloniality of knowledge, coloniality of being, coloniality of power. All of these places are already occupied. That is part of coloniality, this massive occupation. Right? So how do you deoccupy? And how do you engage in counter-extractivist relations? And I think that a number of these movements, particularly the collectives, the formulation of the themes, the dialogue, in some of the different voices, demonstrate how then you can engage in a combative project of interrelationality, of building collective and community. And forming collectives is essential for combativity. Combativity is not an individual project.
Yeah.
It's not about the individual. It's not about single subjects. It's about collectivity and how you transition from the self to the collective in a combative way, right? That you are not simply complying with occupation. You are deoccupying. You are non-aligning yourself, right? Which goes back to the Fanon Decoloniality and the Spirit of Bandung, the 2018 conference of the third Fanon Rencontre, that we focus on the topic of non-alignment. And we can talk with non-alignment deoccupation too. And so as we need to think about occupation, we need to think about extractivism, but also about deoccupation and about counter-extractivism, the multiple ways in which we can do that. So that's one point. The second point is about other challenges that we face. And yes, I think in the, as you were mentioning, this concern with conservatism in South Korea, as we heard before, for example, right? That there is a way in which this conservatism of this modernity coloniality has occupied everything and made many compliant, compliant to follow with this activity. And so within that, particularly in contexts like now, when you have demographic shifts and you have different forms of movements against anti-Blackness through the world and against racism. We saw the video from, against Roma racism in Europe. As these movements grow, usually, also we have seen, and now in the 21st century, these right-wing white movements also growing very strongly. And in the So it's not really in the middle, but I think that some people think in the middle you find liberalism. And liberalism sometimes believes that because the far right is so far to the right, that liberalism seems to be clearly the solution. Right? Clearly. So the races are there. The races are always outside. The races are not in the institutions of liberalism, in the museum. The races are not in the races is not in the university, right? So of course, systemic racism means that this is already inbuilt in these spaces. So, and I think we need to think about how liberalism, and including the liberal arts and sciences, and that involves a large part of universities, are complicit, are systemically connected and complicit and reproduce whiteness, anti-blackness, anti-indigeneity, Islamophobia, anti-Roma racism, and different forms of racism. How what wants to appear as the neutral and in the middle really is nothing but that. And Immanuel Wallerstein had a fascinating, very instructive reflection about liberalism, which he saw as precisely kind of delaying transformation, right? It's like a stopping time. It's a particular way of engaging temporality, space and time, a particular time. Because that means that you, as one of our colleagues in Decolonize This Place, Amin Hussein, has put it, that the institutions, these wars that led to the formations of the institution, these wars passed and they were won by certain sectors and they established these institutions. Mm-hmm. So they don't have to win anymore. They won, they took the territory, right? They took all of this. So that means then that you maintain that simply by delaying change. You don't have to, now do a lot of the change. You have done it, and it's catastrophic. So what you have is to create a world where you can tolerate it as it is. And I think that liberal tolerance is not only about so-called tolerance to different religious points of views, mm-hmm. but ultimately tolerant to living in a world where millions, the large majority of the planet is dispossessed, where Africa is ignored, right? Tolerant to the world we live in. And I think combativeness and decoloniality is about intolerance to that world, but turning to something productive and constructive, about creating linkages with others, creating collectives. And through connecting and creating the collectives, leading to the emergence, as one of the videos says, from the emergency to what emerges, the colectiva feminista. From the emergency to what emerges, to what grows. See also the image of in one of the videos from the Strike MoMA campaign of the flowers at the end. In the ruins of modernity, these flowers begin, and the flowers represent the interconnected struggles of people that are fighting together and then reaching each other through different space. So I think that again, against this liberalism, we need to form these more counter-extractivist, counter-occupational, decolonial force of combativity that are about not simply doing a struggle within the institutions. That's clearly not enough, trying to, within an institution, do something. But I think that one needs to be, as the minimum, within, if you are within, in the university, in the museum, wherever you are. But you have to be, if you want to be really a force for change, you have to be simultaneously outside. You cannot be within and do change and not really being outside. The outside might be the most important part. And then in between the outside and the inside, in between those movements and in between and that institution, and always from below. So I'm thinking within and outside and in between from below. That you need all of those actions for you to maintain or try to maintain a combative struggle. And finally, I don't think that that's possible without love. And yes, I think ultimately without some kind of hope, right? Maybe the Colectiva Feminista calls it radical hope. Maybe this hope, after you lose the hope with liberalism that cannot give you anything, but the fact that you can come together, reach each other, the love and hope maybe of the word of the you, that even today in this circumstance, the you can emerge, that collectivities. And I think that this very activity about combative decoloniality and understanding combativity as partly that will to create collectives, where we would rather maybe, I mean, what is the sense when we are occupied, when the whole system is occupied? What is the meaning when, you know, we have been, in a way, or the world considers that we have been vanquished in every given respect? Why to fight? Why to come together? The fact that you do it, the fact that you go to the streets, like we saw in the video from the Colectiva Feminista, that you are there, engaging people, moving people, that's the moment where, right, I think that that love and that notion of building something new emerges. So, and I think that that's crucial for decolonial combativity, and that things that unfortunately usually do not enter into spaces, into these liberal spaces, right, where you're given other tools to engage differently with the world. And so I think that this text still, it has been now studied and studied and studied in the university, still is waiting for us to keep drawing from it lessons of combativity.
May, do you want to add something?
Go ahead.
Okay, I just would add one point. And I will switch in French. I think, je pense que aussi la notion de combativité décoloniale doit prendre en compte la question de la restitution. Parce que vous avez parlé de la restitution, des expropriations, ça engage à aborder la question des réparations. Et des réparations de manière un peu justement différente de celle que la colonialité du pouvoir veut nous imposer, à savoir que ne pourrait être tout compte fait, entre guillemets, réparés financièrement que des individus ou donc des descendants des ancêtres qui ont été mis en esclavage. Or, quand on est dans une perspective fanonienne, il me semble que ce n'est absolument pas... C'est justement là fermer la porte à l'espoir et à un nouvel homme neuf, à un homme neuf, que de vouloir libéraliser la notion des réparations. Et il est beaucoup plus intéressant de parler justement, de lier à ce travail qui est fait avec différents collectifs sur la question des expropriations et de l'extractivisme pour obtenir des réparations qui soient des réparations collectives et qui s'inscrivent dans un projet décolonial non fini. C'est-à-dire que ça fait partie d'une dynamique qui engage à chaque fois à demander ce qui a été pris depuis 1492 pour que ceux qui se battent avec cette combativité décoloniale puissent identifier les ennemis, mais aussi identifier les conséquences que ça a eues sur la construction d'un continent comme l'Afrique, mais aussi de Haïti, par exemple, et aussi de l'Amérique latine dans ce qu'elle est aujourd'hui, dominée par des européens centrés, alors que les populations indigènes et afrodescendantes sont quasi majoritaires, en tout cas au Brésil, sont majoritaires et sont traitées de façon subalterne et expulsées, aliénées par l'occupation non seulement de leurs terres, mais aussi de leur culture, de leur territoire ancestral, dépossédées de tout ça. Et donc, il me semble que la notion des réparations, on devrait aussi l'aborder d'une manière décoloniale, en tant qu'élément d'un combat décolonial. Je ne sais pas ce que vous en pensez.
Yeah, of course I agree. And obviously those questions of the question of reparations and the question of extractivism are intimately linked, because if there is a project or plan to demand reparations or to try to obtain reparations, or it is because there had an extraction, a form of extraction happened. And there is in the cultural, intellectual domain, I think, and you're completely right about it. I think, Nelson, there is, especially in the Anglo world, there is this domestication and extraction of Black radical thought that is happening, and that has helped to, promote people to launch careers and stuff. And at the same time, there is a form of profound neglect of those traditions of thought, Black, indigenous, in global terms. We don't know much about those traditions of thinking. Yes, there are many people teaching Fanon, but they don't know much about Fanon, and they don't know much about other people like Fanon, right? I think there is a form of watering down of some, well-identified material, like, for instance, Fanon, which is very often read through the deforming lens of either psychoanalysis or, Sartre, like presenting him like a Black Sartre or things of that sort, right? In order to make his thought edible for, a white liberal audience. There is this form of, kind of mutilation of his thought. And at the same time, we don't know much, and we don't teach much about people like the Baron de Vatay in Haiti. We don't know much about people like Stanislas Adotevi, who was a Beninese intellectual, people like Fabien Boussy-Boulaga from Cameroon, all those French, speaking intellectuals who I think defined or, redefined the Black radical tradition. So I think we need those two movements, right? Combat the extractivism of the history of radical Black and indigenous and Latin American ideas, and at the same time finding ways to promote those traditions, right? Not only, focusing on the battlefields that is dictated by the people who are promoting those watered down versions of Fanon or Césaire or, Du Bois, all, the fashionable authors, so to speak. And at the same time, because, they're fashionable for wrong reason, but they have a lot to teach us, right? Obviously, those authors are, of course, towering figures. But at the same time, we need to, find ethical ways to promote those intellectual underdogs that are not so much talked about. And I think we really need those two movements and to, offer this incredible heritage to, in the public sphere, to the people, and to enrich our own understanding of our political traditions and heritage.
Sure. And I just had just one note, because I fully, completely agree with that, and that's completely important. I mean, in the academy, being a specialist of Black radical thinking, maybe what the part of the videos also provoke us to think is that maybe the most effective way where we engage the text and take this, let's say, the ancestors, the thinking of the ancestors, the neglected ancestors seriously, is in a combative, I'm thinking about combative pedagogy, right? A pedagogy that has me encountering these texts and these ideas in a struggle, right? That because some of these ideas have circulated more in movements outside of the university than inside. They have some of figures who are outside. I mean, and Fanon, at the end, he was outside the university, right? You find many of the figures that we celebrate and that we take as major figures producing knowledge. They did it outside the university in dialogue in a combative form outside. And I think that is also very important to include there, that the way, the how, and the who also remains fundamentally combative in character, right? And that requires then that everything changes because the academy and seminars, that has not been created or designed for that kind of engagement. So we have to reimagine, we have to rethink, we have to create new spaces, we have to see. And so, the combative struggle is there. How are you going to transform those spaces to challenge is very extremely difficult. When you have students, for example, even young students who are coming from, Black students, indigenous students, Latinx students come to university, they do well in this world of ideas, and then they want to go, and they face so much trouble and so on, but while they face trouble, they are being oriented to a non-combative engagement with the text. So how do we, as people who teach there, create zones of potential exposure to combative dynamics so that we revive the thinking in the fertile ground where it can really be appreciated, right? And that it can be part of struggles. So how can we integrate more movement-based knowledge production into a place that is more designed for individual scholarly-based knowledge, quote-unquote, knowledge production? So that remains a challenge. And I want to say, maybe we now closing and we want to express our thanks, but I want to express my thanks to both of you as representatives working with the Fanon Foundation. I've come to, in this caminar, juntos y juntas, in this walking together, I think that, my work has been enriching incredibly. And also I think the work of the Institute I am privileged to direct now. I think that this very collaboration is part of the effort to be within, outside, in between, from below, right? That kind of pedagogy intervention to change the very logic of what it is. Not only the content, as Walter Millero sometimes says, but also the very logic, but taking that to the ultimate consequences in terms of the pedagogy and in terms of how you think, who you take as your main interlocutors, and so on. So I want to thank you for this sustained dialogue. We were here in 2018 in the third rencontre of the Fanon Foundation, which also presented a model of engagement, of, I think, combative engagement. And now we're coming back 3 years later in the middle of a pandemic, and we're still trying, you're still working on that. And we have been joined by this wonderful, amazing groups.
Absolutely, all right. Norman?
Well, I'd like also to thank our filming team, of course, Christophe and Omar, for the dedication, for the good work. That's thanks to them that you can have this broadcast, and I hope it's going to stand very long on the internet. Thanks, of course, to the audience. Thanks, Nelson. Thanks, Mireille, for this marvelous setting and organization. And see you soon.
Thanks first to Christophe and Omar. That's right, because without you, this could not happen. Thanks for that. Thanks for your professionalism and your involvement and your decolonial combativity. And love. Thank you. Really, thank you. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to Nelson, to your institute, because you are in your home, university home. And thank you to co-chair the Frantz Fanon Foundation with me, and to Norman, who is a very active and efficient member of the board member, sorry. And I would like just end reading the last page of the Register of the Earth.
I will let you to conclude with that. Let me just quickly say thank you to Pedro Lebrón Ortiz, who translated the invitation, the convocation into Spanish, and also Amanda González Izquierdo, who is a student, graduate student in comparative literature, and she's the assistant of the institute, and she worked on transcripts and also the subtitles and translations and subtitles. Thanks to Amanda González Izquierdo for doing that. This was all done very speedily And also a special thanks to everyone who contributed from different parts of the world.
Fatima
To, yes, Fatima Fisher. Very important. She has helped us, I mean, incredibly. Without her, we couldn't have done this in terms of logistics. And also Nikki O'Malley from here, our team too. And I also thank the School of Arts and Sciences at Rutgers University and our Humanities Dean, Rebecca Wolkowitz, for the support of the Institute. And thanks for all the faculty affiliates and everyone who supports the institutes through the year. We will have several activities next semester. You will hear more soon about them. But Mireille, I pass it to you, and you can.
Okay, I would like just finish and this session by reading the last paragraph of The Riches of the Earth, but I will read it in French. Si nous voulons que l'humanité avance d'un cran, si nous voulons la porter à un niveau différent de celui où l'Europe l'a manifesté, alors il faut inventer, il faut découvrir. Si nous voulons répondre à l'attente de nos peuples, il faut chercher ailleurs qu'en Europe. Davantage, si nous voulons répondre à l'attente des Européens, il ne faut pas leur renvoyer une image même idéale de leur société et de leurs pensées, pour lesquelles ils éprouvent épisodiquement une immense nausée. Pour l'Europe, pour nous-mêmes et pour l'humanité, camarades, il faut faire peau neuve, développer une pensée neuve, tenter de mettre sur pied un homme neuf. And I think it is what we try to do with a decolonial combativity for the 60th anniversary of the death of Frantz Fanon. Thank you.